Mario Kart 64 is incredibly broken, with skips that come in several varieties, some that let you jump over walls, some that abuse Lakitu placements, some that the developers intentionally left in, and some that defy logic altogether. Speedrunners have been running this game for the better part of 3 decades and are still striving to optimize it to this day. But one of them pondered a simple question: what would a perfect run look like? This is the Mario Kart 64 tool-assisted speedrun explained. Luigi Raceway is a track with a lot of shortcuts, but one shortcut that you may not have heard about is this video's sponsor, Drink Control. Drink Control's mission is to bring healthy food options to gamers, and they have a great selection of meals and snacks that will help you meet your nutritional needs. Cooking food can take time, and if you're in an intense gaming session, the meal replacement shakes are a great option to keep you gaming, as the total prep time can be completed between game lobbies. And if you don't believe me, check out this Cinnamon Toast speedrun. The ease of assembly isn't the only thing that makes the shakes convenient. With 23 grams of protein, 8 grams of fiber, and only a single gram of sugar, it helps keep you full for hours. If you're not feeling like a full meal but still need something that will fit your macros, the protein cookies with real chunks of chocolate and Oreo pieces help get the job done. A new world record, and I didn't use a single skip. So if you're ready to up your nutrition game, go to drinkcontrol.com/abyssoft and use code Abyssoft to get 10% off your order. And if you're having trouble deciding what you want, use the bundle builder and try all of their different products at a discount. And with that, let's get into the video. This task was created by Drew Weatherton in 2016. He plays on the fastest game mode, 150 cc's. This turns on special abilities for the CPU players that factor in, as we'll see later. And before we get to the first track, there are a few minor time saves already at work. He needs to select which game mode he will play on, what character he will play as, and which cup he will compete on. But a clever trick with the controller ports lets him do all of this in just a few short frames.
Grand Prix. Select your player. Select map.
To select Grand Prix and 150cc, he needs to do 4 inputs, 1 to select the game mode, 2 to toggle down to the difficulty, and 1 to confirm. But by using 4 controllers, he can execute this in a single frame. This is because the game reads inputs from all 4 controllers while on the game select screen. So by queuing the inputs, he can have the game read them in order for a single frame menu. This doesn't apply on the character select screen, where only the first player controller is active. Toad, Yoshi, and Peach are the fastest characters, but the cursor's starting position is directly above Yoshi, so he saves 6 frames by making the objectively best character choice. He can select the cups in any order, but opts to do them linearly. And with the Mushroom Cup underway, we're ready to go over the first track of the game, Luigi Raceway. At the start of the race, he does 2 things. He holds A at the correct time during the countdown to get a boost off the goal line, and he enters an AB spin. The AB spin is a state where you surprisingly hold A and B. It reduces your top speed, but greatly increases your turning capacity. The only catch is you need to be going under 10 kilometers an hour to initiate it. Since Yoshi starts in an AB spin, then gets a boost, the speed restriction never comes into effect. But there is another problem. He needs to jump off of DK, but Luigi is in the way. If you slam into a CPU while boosting and jump, you will be launched into the air, with the height you receive depending on the weight of your character and the weight of the character you're hitting. Yoshi has the second lowest weight in the game next to Toad, and DK has the highest, which means you'll receive a large amount of height, but Luigi is blocking the path. So Drew pushes him out of the way so that the line is clear to do a CPU jump off of DK. He angles the jump to pass through the grass above the tunnel, which doesn't have collision in this version, and lands directly onto an item box below, all while maintaining the AB spin so he can maneuver tightly. The item box is confirmed on the earliest possible frame so he can pick up another item in reserve, which brings us to the next part of the skip, the Mile Style. Discovered by Miles Buckram, the Mile Style is a very unique trick. When he approaches the sloped section, the polygons are marked as tumble sections, which should send him into a tumble, but instead he gets a large jump. So what's happening? Yoshi doesn't actually touch the tumble polygon. Instead, he lands on the scene between the drivable track and the tumble polygons and presses jump. This results in a bounce with some height, but it's not enough to clear the wall, so he needs to do a second jump. But this one is even more unique. He lands on the seam again, but the polygon above isn't a tumble polygon. It's marked as a wall, which isn't coded to let you bounce off of it. So he should be forced into a tumble, as there's no surface with a bounce property. But if we look under the hood, we see why he gets a second jump. The physics calculations for the game are performed on subframes, which means they run multiple times per frame. We don't need to get into how these work. All that's important is that if you touch the wall first on one subframe, and then touch the tumble surface on the next subframe, you can get a bounce when you jump on the frame after these calculations have ran. This gets him over the wall, and before he lands, he needs to manipulate his angle so that he can jump over the wall again, as there aren't any CPUs this time. This is where the items come in. The red shell is perfect because it sends you flying with a lot of height when you're hit, but there are two issues. When a red is shot, it will travel for some distance before it returns to the path markers in the middle of the track and continues forward as it homes in on its target. Don't worry about path markers now, as we'll come back to them later. He can't shoot the red at any angle here because the track is narrow, so he needs to find a spot where the shell won't hit the far wall and that gives him enough time to get in front of it. From his current location, he doesn't have time to reach the shell before this happens, so he needs to use the mushroom to get out in front of it, which sends him to the second lap where he repeats the process. On lap 3, he doesn't need a red shell since he won't be completing the lap skip again, so he grabs a single shroom and performs a boosted jump off the seam, which gives him enough air to make the jump in one bounce. This is slightly slower than a double bounce due to the amount of time he spends in the air, but the CPUs have made it around the track and Luigi would block him if he did a double bounce, so it's a necessary time loss. So why was he able to skip a lap? The answer lies in how the game tracks progress. The course is divided into sections which are tracked in memory as you drive the lap. Inside of each section are path markers, and if you look at the progress UI, every time your character advances, they're getting associated with a new path marker. If you're within 20 path markers of the finish line on either side, the goal will be turned on, otherwise it's deactivated, and the line extends far beyond its visual representation. If you haven't left the starting area on lap 1 or after completing a lap and drive backwards over the line, the game will also subtract a lap from you to prevent cheating. Additionally, the game will only start counting progress on a lap when you get associated with a path marker greater than 20. And for this skip, you're leaving the finish line area when you jump the wall, so the finish line gets turned off. When you land, the game has to assign you a path marker, so it gives you one in the tunnel, which is greater than 20, so the game assumes you're making progress on the lap. When you jump the wall, it sees that you're within 20 path markers of the finish line, so it activates the goal, which lets you complete the lap. Basically, as long as you start a lap with the finish line active, you only have to hit a path marker outside of the 20 marker check for it to deactivate the finish line and assume you're making progress. Moo Moo Farm doesn't have a known shortcut, so the task relies on perfect driving to beat it as fast as possible, which means it's a good time to talk about the main mechanic of Mario Kart, the Mini Turbo. On its face, the Mini Turbo is simple enough. Press R to initiate a jump and keep holding it to enter into a slide. While sliding, steer your stick the direction you want to go, then countersteer a couple of times to build charge. And once the smoke coming out of your tires turns red, you release R for a small speed boost. That sounds simple enough, but there are lots of intricacies to be accounted for. From start to finish, there are 7 different states you progress through when performing a Mini Turbo, and each has a required amount of frames that need to pass before you can transition to the next, with the first 5 states having static requirements. The final 2 have some variation as to when you can let them go, but this is situational and depends on factors such as how long of a turn you're in, as it can be beneficial to cut a Mini Turbo off and start a new one before reaching the glide turn, or to hold one of the final 2 states a bit longer to get a better angle. On top of this, there's a secret piece of tech called a Xeno Slide, where you toggle the stick while sliding to build more speed, and the faster you toggle, the more you speed up. The Xeno Slide does have a trade-off, however, as the longer you hold a Mini Turbo, the more speed you'll lose due to curving your angle more steeply, which results in a less direct route. So this is typically only used on long slides where you can save a few hundredths of a second, or when benefiting from a boost. Speaking of boosts, since this track doesn't have any shortcuts, items are used to generate a lot of speed. So let's look at the physics of the star and mushroom. When under the effects of a star, your speed is increased by 20%. You can still do mini turbos, although they become more difficult to optimize as the increased speed doesn't come with increased handling, so your turns won't be as sharp, and the mini turbo frame requirements remain the same. The benefits of a star last for 9 seconds, which gives Weatherton a large window for adding in Xenoslides on the long mini turbo sections. A mushroom has a much shorter duration, lasting about 3 seconds, and only increases your speed by 10%. With another 3% being achievable if you perform a Xenoslide while boosting. Due to the shorter duration, it can be very difficult to find spots for the Xenoslide to be beneficial, making a shroom one of the hardest items to optimize. In fact, across the entire track, there's only one Xenoslide, and it occurs on the final shroom to save just a few hundredths of a second. The next track doesn't have a skip either, but that doesn't stop it from having broken interactions. In fact, as far as skipless tracks go, it's the most broken in the game. Out of the gate, an exploit is used to trick the game into thinking you're in second place so you can get a star. At the Koopa-shaped rock, there are 2 paths you can take, but path markers only exist on one side of the rock. So by taking a wide angle to the right when entering the left path, Yoshi gets associated with a path marker earlier in the course and won't get close enough to another until after an AI has passed him. So while in first, he's technically in second. He will only be in second place for half a second, so he confirms the item for a star, which is a 5% chance. Speaking of items, it's about time we went over the RNG. The game has a total of 14 items, and depending on what place you're in when you confirm an item box, the items you can receive will vary. In first place, there are only 8 items you can pull, with green shells and bananas having the highest chance of appearing, but in second place, you can get anything except a single banana or the blue shell, so when you can take a second place item without sacrificing time, it's almost always worth it to get a star. So how does Weatherton ensure he gets the exact item he needs? It's not dumb luck. Instead, he manipulates RNG, but it's not as simple as pressing a few buttons. Mario Kart's RNG formula has 4 parameters. The RNG value, which is a random number from 0 to 99, the ABR buttons, which is a counter that goes up each frame one of these buttons are pressed, the race frames, which is a counter that goes up each frame of a race from start to finish, and the last item selected, which is the item table number of the last item the player had. There's only one variable that can be controlled, and that's the ABR buttons. If you hold one button, the counter goes up in increments of 1. If you hold 2, it advances by 2, and holding all 3 buttons advances it by 3. Since these buttons all affect driving in a large way, there's only 2 times that it's safe to increment RNG: before a race has started, and while you're in the air. Altering RNG before the race only works on the first item box you encounter, so all of the subsequent boxes need to be altered in the brief amount of time you're in the air when you initiate a mini turbo, either by releasing R for a few frames, which will alter the count by -5, or by pressing B while in the air, which has no noticeable effect on your speed. Despite these limitations, the RNG is successfully manipulated across all 12 items picked up on this track. But there's another item trick that we need to look at, and that's the finish line glitch. For some reason, this polygon next to the finish line is mismapped, and the game will interpret your position as being in 8th place while you're on it. This lets you grab an 8th place item no matter what place you're actually in, and Weatherton uses a boo to grab a star, but the boo itself isn't a normal item. In Grand Prix mode, the boo doesn't actually steal an item. Instead, it functions as an item box that has a 20% chance to give you nothing. When the boo is used with the finish line glitch, you have a 30% chance to get a star, which makes the RNG manip a bit easier. So that's what Drew does on laps 2 and 3. As for the technical driving sections, there are 2 things worth pointing out. The first is the ramp leading into the tunnel, which is a built-in shortcut. You can't charge a mini turbo while you're in the air, but you can hold any charge you've built up beforehand. So by doing a full mini turbo before leaving the ramp, you can hold it in the air and let go for a boost upon landing. The last unique part of this track is that it's the only one in the game with a water hazard you can drive through. It's set on a cycle, so you won't have to deal with it on lap 1, but going into lap 2, the tide is at its highest, so Drew is forced to drive through it and take a speed reduction. You might think it's quicker to drive around, but that puts you on an inferior line for the next turn and would end up costing more time than driving in the water. And on lap 3, he has a shroom, and while boosting, you ignore speed penalties from terrain, which lets him take the fastest line to the goal without a problem. We are now at the last track of the Mushroom Cup, where an Easter egg shortcut and unique CPU jump are the star attractions. At the first item boxes, he confirms triple greens while in first, then sandbags into second place for a star. He doesn't need 2 of the green shells, so he fires them off before entering the tunnel, then sends the third down the tunnel, and we'll get to why in a second, because first, we have a skip to do. If you're inside of the tunnel and are traveling in a counterclockwise direction while you have a star active, the game will give you a lap courtesy of the developers. It only works on the first and second laps, so you can't end a race with it, and the way it works is a bit crazy. Remember how I said the finish line extends for a long distance? That's true on every track except for Calamari Desert. On this course, the line ends right at the wall near the goal. But if you're using a star, it gets extended all the way to the tunnel and is set active, which is why the skip works. As for the green he shot down the tunnel, he's going to use it to jump the fence and get back on the track, but the star is still active. It lasts for 9 seconds from the time it's triggered, which means he'll have to wait unless he finds a way to get rid of it, which he discovered on accident while making this task. If you enter a tumble while a star is active, the game will remove the invincibility state from you. However, there aren't any tumble polygons in the tunnel, but this didn't stop Drew from creating one himself. When experimenting with turns in the tunnel, he accidentally ran into the seam between polygons in this corner, and to his surprise, it took him out of the star state. The reason you tumble has to do with the wall's hitboxes, as this is an open corner. Wall hitboxes have a quarter of it sit in front and the other 3/4 trail behind. When 2 walls are joined together and there is a convex curve, part of the hitboxes are aligned in such a way that if you drive on the seam, the game will put you into a tumble due to being in contact with 2 hitboxes at the same time. With the star nullified, he heads for the green shell and jumps the fence, which saves having to exit the tunnel at one of the train crossings. He lands onto an item box to pick up a shroom, which he uses to get another shroom on his way to complete the second lap. And with the CPUs on their way to the finish line, he sets up for the next skip. There's a lot at play here, so let's break it down. He shrooms to perform a large CPU jump off of Wario. This gets him above the wall, where he can slip through a gap and land inside of the level. Beneath every course is a water plane so that players won't fall forever should they get out of bounds, which triggers Lakitu to come rescue him. He's then placed at the start of the finish line and gets credited for an instant lap. But why? When Lakitu decides where to set you down, the game checks for the last section you were in and then the last path marker you were associated with in that section. Since he jumped from in front of the finish line, the game had this stored as his section, so that's where he gets set down. When he jumps out of bounds, the finish line isn't active due to it ending at the wall, so the game thinks he's behind the line and making progress on the lap, so the third lap ends as soon as he's placed on the track. This is quite amazing, as the only reason this works is because of how the developers coded the hidden shortcut. If the finish line didn't end at the wall, the game would know you're cheating, but since they offered a free shortcut, why not take 2? Since a cup has been finished, a reset is performed so the next one can be selected quickly, but this time he selects Toad over Yoshi, which is a 6-frame time loss, and we'll find out why shortly. He starts the race in an AB spin with a boost and jumps to get on top of Luigi. Since he's hitting a CPU, he gets some height, although it's not a lot because Luigi isn't a very heavy character, but it is enough to get in front of the rest of the racers. He maintains the AB spin up to the item boxes. While this would normally be a time loss from the reduced top speed, he does it for 2 reasons. First, he will confirm a mushroom before triggering another item box, which he will sandbag into a lower place to get a star. And second, he's going to perform a CPU jump, so he needs to wait for Wario to get in the correct position. Toad's Turnpike is a figure 8 that loops under itself, so by jumping off of Wario, you can cut out the first loop entirely. The reason Toad was picked is because while he shares identical stats with Yoshi and Peach, he weighs 22% less. This lets him jump higher off of CPUs, allowing for more distance and making this particular jump possible. When he lands, he uses the star, then picks up a boo. It's worth noting that the star's invincibility outlasts the visual effect by a small amount of time. So while it may appear that the star has ended, he still has a few frames of invulnerability, which lets him drive through the bus without getting hit. The boo serves two purposes on this track. Since he's in first place, he's limited in what items he can receive, so a shell is selected. And once the boo is used, he gets another state of invincibility, which lets him take a faster path around the track since he doesn't have to worry about the traffic. He activates and holds the shell to make room for another item, because with the CPUs only at the halfway point, he needs to improvise to perform the skip again. The walls beyond the fence have no collision, so he only needs the small height from hitting a green to clear the fence and grass at this angle, whereas the CPU jump required a lot of distance and height due to Wario's placement. It's worth noting that the mini turbos he performs while under the boo's invincibility are frame perfect in how close to the wall they are. If he was any closer, he would make contact and lose speed. For the final lap, Bowser is almost in a perfect position for another CPU jump, but not quite. So he gives him a small nudge to push him into place before doing the third jump. On the final slide of the game, you can also see his angle changed a few times. This is the result of a Xeno slide being used to optimize his speed to save a few hundredths of a second.
I'm the best!
After Toad's Turnpike, we arrive at Frap Snowland, the first track where you don't need to use a CPU jump to exploit the lap progression for a skip. It starts off with an AB spin to get turned around. There are NPCs in the way, but more time is saved by hitting them than avoiding them. This is due to a property of the AB spin that lets you turn more sharply while in the air, so the small amount they bump you vertically allows for a more aggressive line to the bridge. The bridge itself isn't special, but coincidentally, its path marker is outside of the finish line proximity check, which is why it's the starting place for this skip, as the game will assume you're making progress on the lap with this as your path marker. From the bridge, you'll jump onto the snow to the left of the finish line while taking care not to touch the track. The snow is marked FF in memory, which means it's unknown and not associated with any section, so while you're on it, your section won't get updated. But if you touch the track, the game will update your section from the bridge, which would ruin the trick. Once on the snow, he drives just beyond the finish line, then hits an out of bounds trigger. At this moment, the game hasn't tracked you as having made any progress on the lap, as it considers you to still be at the start of the race, but that's about to change. Since we hopped over the track from the bridge, our section is stored as the one from the bridge, so Lakitu brings us back to that location when he picks us up. The game now thinks we've gone from the start of the lap to the end, so by repeating the trick, we get credited for a lap as we cross the line, then get taken back to the end of the lap. You might be wondering why the finish line is active, and that's because while our section won't update while on the snow, our path marker will, so the game turns the finish line on when we're within the 20 marker check. As for the technical driving details on this track, there are only two things to break down. At the start of each lap, an AB spin is used to quickly get in position on the bridge. Then a trick called the Fast Accel is used, where you frame perfectly accelerate by triple tapping A. As there's not enough room for a mini turbo to be beneficial, so none are performed. On the second lap, he drives slightly more ahead of the finish line so that Lakitu will place him closer to the goal, as it's faster to drive over the line on the last lap, so he doesn't need to start from the bridge to set up another skip. Wait, why was there a lightning bolt? The 8th place CPU has a 1 in 100 chance to use a bolt, and since this race doesn't use any items, Weatherton manipulated the RNG so that we'd get to see a bolt once in the TAS. Perhaps the most famous track in all of Mario Kart 64, Choco Mountain is home to the Weathertenko, the most precise skip in the entire run. To execute the trick, a mushroom is required, and since it needs to be performed 3 times, a triple shroom is the fastest option. This item can't be obtained in first place, so when he reaches the item boxes, he grabs a single shroom, then crashes into the wall to initiate a tumble. This gets him turned around faster than using an AB spin, since he would need to get under 10 km per hour to enter one, and would lose time slowing down. He uses the single shroom to boost back into the item boxes, then confirms for triple shrooms once his rank allows for it. This gives him all of the ammunition he needs for 3 weather tankos, but first, he needs to get set up. Arriving at the finish line, he needs to make a 90-degree turn to face the wall, which is difficult due to how thin the track is. The fastest way is by sliding the back of the cart over the wall, which helps him get turned without having to compromise on speed. He's now in position to execute the weather tanko, which requires 2 things, a very precise angle and a very precise amount of height. The way this trick works is a bit ridiculous, but when you jump up in the air, you touch the top of the wall for a single frame, which for some strange reason has its geometry mapped to the tunnel section down the track, so while you're touching it, the game thinks you're very far ahead in the lap and are making progress. After touching the top, you'll start to fall, and while descending, you need to cross behind the finish line while staying above the wall section. If you cross over onto the track too early, the game will update your section, which kills the skip. But while you're over the wall, the game still thinks you're at the tunnel section until you land, where it then puts you at the end of the lap. After crossing the line, he then sets up for a second skip, but I'd like to go back to the single frame he touches the top of the wall, because by all accounts, this trick shouldn't work, as Lackey 2 should come and pick him up as soon as he touches the wall. So what gives? Mario Kart runs at 60 frames per second, but visually it only updates every second frame, with these being known as input frames, as it only accepts inputs from the player on these frames. The frames in between input frames are called lag frames, with physics updates taking place on both lag frames and input frames. Lakitu will only ever function while the game is on an input frame, however, so if you touch the top of the wall on a lag frame, physics calculations are still running, so your section gets updated to the tunnel. And on the next frame, you're no longer touching the top of the wall, so Lakitu will never come to pick you up. To end the final lap, he reverses over the finish line, as you can still fast excel in reverse despite the top speed being 12 km an hour. But since we are only going a few units of distance, this is the fastest option over turning around and driving forward.
I'm the best!
There's a well-known shortcut on this track that was published in the official strategy guide, which Nintendo Power encouraged people to use in their contest for the golden N64 controllers. But that's too slow, so Drew opted for something a lot faster. He needs to get triple reds and can't do this while in first, so he drops down to second and confirms the item on the first possible frame, then grabs a second set. As mentioned previously, red shells use the path marker system for their pathing, and if they're fired at an angle, they will travel in the direction shot for a bit, then turn around and take the closest path to the center. It's also worth noting that he needs reds for this skip. Greens won't give you enough height to clear the wall, but red shells come with their own problem. When you're hit by a red, you bounce when landing on the ground. This loses a lot of time, but Weatherton has a clever trick to avoid this. He angles his descent so that he barely touches the wall, which puts him into a tumble. The tumble has a much faster recovery than the bounce, and before he hits the ground, he fires off another red so that he can go back over the wall. A fast excel into an AB spin takes care of the tight movement required, and he repeats this skip twice on each lap. But there's one shell we need to dive into. On the second to last shell he fires, it disappears into the far wall, only to reappear from underground just in time to send him flying. The reason it goes through the wall without expiring is because the collision hasn't loaded for the wall yet, due in part to how he's jumping over the wall. What happens next, we don't actually know how to explain, but our theory is that the shell drops below the map, as there's no drivable surface on the other side of the wall it just passed through. It then makes its way back to the course as it tries to find the nearest path marker before erupting through the floor for the final skip, as it appears to teleport from behind the wall to hitting Toad. After this hit, he only needs to cross the wall one more time, so he attempts to land on the finish line, which requires him to exploit lag frames. The position he needs to land on is so precise that on a lag frame you need to be over the wall, and on the input frame you need to be past the finish line. The result ends up being so precise that if the joystick was moved by this much of a unit, it wouldn't work, and for good measure, he fires off his final shell so that it zooms towards the camera.
I'm the best!
We are now at the Star Cup, which starts with Wario Stadium, another track with a well-known wall jump skip. Toad is the chosen character for this cup. He's not the fastest on this track due to the height he gets off of CPU jumps, but he does make it up later in the cup, so let's dive in. The first jump is relatively easy, as it's an AB spin to get the correct angle into a jump off of DK. The AB spin is continued so Toad can quickly turn as he executes the next jump, but this time there isn't a CPU. To get over the wall in this situation, he jumps after making contact. We'll call this a wall ricochet since the word bounce is used for its own mechanic. But all that's happening is the force being added from hitting the wall is being added to the jump input. Wall ricochets can be fickle, with the window for the R press sometimes being a single frame, and other times having an input window of 4 frames. After the first lap, he no longer needs the AB spin, so he turns sharply left to maintain speed and keeps hopping the wall. The only exception is the final jump, as he uses an AB spin to turn more sharply, which saves 1/100th of a second. Like the other skips in the game, the reason this trick works is because you're jumping ahead to a path marker greater than 20, so the game will start logging progress on the lap. When you jump over the wall, you're within 20 path markers of the finish line, so when you pass over the goal, you get credited for a lap.
I'm the best!
Sherbetland is another broken track with perhaps one of the most creative skips in the entire TAS, as Weatherton is going to jump to the island in the middle. The setup requires turning around, so just like on Choco Mountain, he uses the wall to get some extra help. Except this time, he goes into a full tumble, as he has some buffer while waiting for the CPU to get into position. Now comes the tricky part. He triggered an item box, which he forced to be a shroom. He's going to use the boost to jump to the island, but before this, he needs to get 2 more item boxes. By pulling a tight circle, he can grab the first item box and confirm it for triple reds, but now there's a problem. The box he used hasn't respawned yet, and Donkey Kong is going to take the other available box. So he improvises. The frame after he collides with Wario, he gets launched at an angle that has him barely touch the hitbox for the item box to the right, which he then uses to confirm triple shrooms. What Weatherton is trying to do for this skip is reach a section on the other side of the track. He can't reach it from this side even with a boosted CPU jump, and a shell jump from the island on its own won't get him there either. But with a shell jump boosted by a shroom, he can just barely reach it. He starts shooting off shells as soon as he lands. The second shell is the one he'll be jumping off of, as the first shell goes off the edge, and the third shell needs to be cleared so he can use the shrooms. He then enters a boosted slide as soon as it's clear of his inventory. After hitting the shell jump, he gets associated with a section on the other side of the course, but now has to eat the biggest time loss of the run, getting picked up by Lakitu. Getting rescued from water takes the longest of any Lakitu event, and the water on Sherbetland leaves you stuck in an ice cube for an added time loss. He consumes the remaining shrooms to pick up a boo and make sure to touch this polygon on the way by the finish line, and he now has some time to kill while waiting for CPUs. With the CPUs in position, he jumps off of Bowser and lands on the wall behind the finish line before tumbling down, where he enters an AB spin to set up for another jump off of DK. In order for the game to deactivate the finish line and start tracking lap progress, he needs to get to a path marker larger than 20, with the closest spot being a path marker in Section 2, which is why he drives out in front of the line on each lap. Once in Section 2, he jumps off a heavyweight and over the wall side of the finish line, as this trick won't work if you go over the water. For some strange reason, the polygon for this wall is marked FF, and while you're over it or touching it, the game won't update your section, so you can sneak behind the finish line without activating it, as it thinks you're still in Section 2. Once you touch the track, it updates your section to 18 and activates the finish line again, so you get credit for a lap, as it was completely unaware of the chicanery that was just pulled.
I'm the best!
If you thought Sherbetland was impressive, Royal Raceway will blow your mind. as it's the only track in the game where Drew uses a different skip on each lap. Lap 1, he needs to get triple shrooms, so after bouncing on a wall to help him get turned, he confirms the item box while in second place, then immediately hits a shroom. This lets him jump off of Bowser and clip to the top of the bridge while still charging a mini turbo. The reason he's able to pass through is because the bridge's collision isn't active from this side. He continues the shroom, then hits the boost pad where he sets up the skip. You may have seen this before, as it was a common method of cheating a lap from about the time of the game's discovery. To perform it, you take a left turn off the boost pad and hit a specific polygon to update your section, which has Lakitu take you to the other side of the track. The original shortcut takes you in front of the item boxes, but we want to go behind them, so we'll hit slightly to the left, which gets us assigned to a different path marker. Once Lakitu places us down, both shrooms will be consumed so we can get a boo. Do you have any guesses as to what he's going to confirm it for? Let me know down below. If you guessed blue shell, that's correct. And if you skipped ahead to get the answer, then commented, you owe me a subscription if you're unsubscribed. The reason he's able to get a blue shell while in first is because there's a mismapped polygon on either side of the finish line, which allows for an 8th place item while in first, just like on Koopa Troopa Beach. While he needs the boo to get the blue shell, he doesn't need the invincibility state, so he spins out the frame he activates it, which nullifies the boo due to how the operations are performed under the hood. The reason he needs a blue shell over a red is because a red won't home in on him while he's in first, but with a blue he can self-target, which will send Toad on top of this wall. The wall isn't a drivable surface, so Lakitu will come and pick you up, but by getting up here, the closest path marker is on the bridge, so he places you just before the boost ramp. He needs to do the shortcut jump, but needs to get more distance to avoid losing time from falling in the water. And by sandbagging his speed, he can do a CPU jump off Luigi with enough height to clear the water and land on the item boxes where he gets a single shroom. The shroom is for the final CPU jump of the track, and after he jumps off of Bowser, he falls into the water. Lakitu comes to rescue him and places him behind the line, and when he crosses, he's rewarded with a lap. But why? When he performs the CPU jump, he's already at the end of lap 2, so that lap will count due to the previous setup. But he then gets placed behind the finish line despite landing in the water ahead of the finish line. This is because he crossed over a specific seam between these two polygons, which updated his section to be behind the finish line. So when he makes the CPU jump, as long as he doesn't touch a polygon that updates his section, Lakitu will take him back behind the line, and while he's over the water, his section won't update. Lakitu then places him at his last known section, which the game recognizes as being behind the finish line. He's now outside of the 20 path marker check, so it assumes he's making progress on the lap, which just leaves driving over the goal to complete the race.
I'm the best!
Bowser's Castle is a track with a lot of driving, as there isn't a shortcut to take advantage of on the first lap, but some very important actions need to be taken so that a CPU jump can be performed on laps 2 and 3. One thing worth mentioning about the driving section is how he takes certain corners. For corners that form a 90-degree angle, he slides around them normally, but on corners with a beveled edge, it's actually faster to slightly bump them, as your kart will get turned faster without any loss of speed, which brings us to the items. For the first time in the task, he's going to get an item other than a shell or mushroom and gets a banana bunch while in first, then sandbags to get triple shrooms. The reason he needs the banana bunch is to space out the heavyweight CPUs, and it's time we talked about the rubber banding in the game. The CPUs in Mario Kart do not play fair. In fact, they straight up ignore the physics of the game while they're off screen. While players need to charge mini turbos through corners to maintain speed, CPUs can drive them without any speed reduction, and if they take them too tightly, they'll just straight up ignore collision. This poses a big problem, as Drew needs specific spacing between the heavyweights or he won't be able to make the CPU jumps. To accomplish this, he drops bananas in specific placements to hit DK and impede his progress, the only use of offensive items in the task where he isn't targeting himself. With Donkey Kong slowed down, he turns around for Bowser, who he only has a few frames to spare on when making the jump. As for some unexplained reason, the bananas he released actually increased Bowser's speed. With Donkey Kong, he once again only has a few frames to spare, and when landing, the kart will touch the wall slightly so that he can turn around quicker and use the last shroom to boost over the goal. While this is the first CPU jump to involve going outside of the finish line and back in on the same jump, it works the same as the others. Jump from a path marker greater than 20 and stay over the water until you're behind the line, as your section won't update while you're over the lava. Then cross the line for a lap, as the game thinks you've progressed around the entire track.
I'm the best!
This brings us to the final cup of the game, the Special Cup, and it starts with Donkey Kong's Jungle Parkway. In the first cup of a new track, you always start in 8th place, which should be a benefit given that the shortcut is in the cave, but it's actually a bad starting position for getting turned around. He's forced to bounce off the wall, which converts some of his speed into turn capacity, which brings us to the shortcut. It's possible to jump through the seam in the wall, which takes you slightly out of bounds before you land back in the cave. The finish line extends so that it's possible to cross it in this out-of-bounds section, and during the jump, your path marker will get updated, meaning that while you're falling, you get associated with a path marker that activates the finish line. When you re-enter the cave, the finish line gets turned off since you get tagged to a path marker outside of the finish line check, so the game thinks you're making progress and places you at the end of the lap. And by repeating the shortcut, you can then cheat multiple lap skips. For laps 1 and 2, he needs to grab a shroom to speed things up, but he won't use the first shroom immediately, as he does a fast accel on this polygon seam, which helps turn him faster without cancelling his acceleration. The fast accel gives him the bare minimum amount of speed to make the jump without falling into the water, and when he lands back in the cave, he gets a small tumble from hitting the inside of the wall when he clips back in, so he performs a jump that doesn't visually register to help get turned around. He then does the lap skip one more time while AB spinning and jumps at the earliest possible frame so that he spends the least amount of time in the air. If he jumped any sooner, he would come up short and crash land in the water. For the final lap, he doesn't need to complete the skip again, as it's faster to drive to the finish line by 1/10 of a second, so he takes the corner very tight and finishes the course in just over 15 seconds.
I'm the best!
Another track with a skip that's been known about since the 90s, Yoshi Valley tricks the game into giving a lap skip in a very unique way. The skip works in a very clever way. By using the start boost combined with a brief AB spin to get turned around, you can jump just before going down the slope to clear the fence. This is the easy part. The key interaction of this skip is hitting a specific part of the wall and getting bounced to the left. When you jump the wall, you're in front of the finish line and are associated with a path marker less than 20, so the goal is active. When Toad hits the wall, he gets associated with path markers on that part of the track, so the finish line deactivates. It's important to note two things here. Since we only touch the wall and not the drivable track, our section doesn't get updated. If our section was updated, Lakitu would take us to that side of the valley, but since our section is stored as being by the finish line, Lakitu takes us back to that side, and equally important, we're currently in front of the finish line, and need to get behind it. Fortunately, there's a small portion of the wall that will send you left when hit. This barely gets us behind the line, but barely is all we need, as the game now thinks we're behind the line and that we've made progress on the lap. Lakitu then takes us back to the section we jumped from, which is right in front of the finish line, and we get credit for the lap upon landing, as we've just gone from behind the finish line to in front of it, with all of the conditions to complete a lap being satisfied. When setting up the next two lap skips, it's important that we turn sharply, as Lakitu places you on the path marker you were last associated with in the section you're being placed in, and the lap skip won't work if he places you on a path marker greater than 20, as the finish line will be turned off. For laps 2 and 3, Drew doesn't have the start boost or a mushroom to take advantage of, as grabbing items would lose time. But with the mini turbo, he gets just enough speed to clear the fence and make the jump.
I'm the best!
We are now at the second last track of the game, and it's the last track with no RTA skip, which means it's time for more CPU jumps. The first lap is spent driving, but since he can only get just so far ahead of the CPUs, it doesn't need to be perfectly optimized, and you'll see he doesn't jam in mini turbos when under the effects of the star, since the CPUs will just cheat harder to catch up. He does have to take an inward turning slide on the ramp section to keep the kart grounded, otherwise he would get air and lose speed. Aside from that, there's not much to talk about on lap 1, except which path is faster in the bat house, which is the right side by exactly 1 frame, in case you were wondering. At the start of lap 2, he has just enough time to turn around and make the jump off of Bowser, and upon landing, he makes sure to clip the fence, which helps him turn faster. You can already see DK on screen at this point, so he takes a second hit on the shroom and then bumps the wall to lose his boost state, which gives him enough mobility to turn around. At this point, he has no time to spare and must shroom immediately in order to hit DK. And not only is the window to perform the skip tight, but from this angle, he doesn't have any leeway on re-entering the track. It's precise down to the frame. The reason he used a golden shroom and not triple shrooms is because the golden shroom lasts long enough that he can use a 4th boost after he lands on lap 3 to save more time at the end.
I'm the best!
We are now at the most iconic track in all of Mario Kart, Rainbow Road, and Weatherton doesn't disappoint for the finale. Out of the gate, he uses the boost to go backwards so he can pick up 2 items, a blue shell and then a golden shroom. He picks up a blue shell for a few reasons. First, it's faster to equip a blue shell than triple reds. The blue shell travels faster than a red, and if he picked up the reds, he would need to shoot off 2 of them, which also takes time. But the blue shell does come with a drawback. When you're hit with a red or blue shell, you're sent into a tumble, which isn't a problem if you're on the track. But we're going to use the hit to get out of the track, and while you're falling in a tumble, your speed is slower, which is unacceptable. So he does something ingenious to avoid the tumble. He shoots the blue shell backwards, and then the magic happens. The frame he gets hit, he uses the super shroom. Due to a bizarre physics interaction, this changes the order of operations for the collision and the boost in the subframes, and he's left in a state where he gets the height from the hit and the boost from the shell, but no tumble state. The golden shroom is important because it will expire before he lands, whereas if he took the triple shrooms, he would have 2 more charges to consume after landing. This way, his item slot is open and he can immediately set up another skip. When he gets placed down, he's now in first, so blue shells and triple reds are off the table, but triple greens are a possibility and let him avoid having to get items again, so he forces greens, then equips them on the first possible frame. When you shoot a green shell, there is a brief period of time where you're immune to your own shell, so he makes sure to hit the green on the first frame the invulnerability drops and then starts his fall. The tumble from a green while falling isn't infinite like a red or blue, and during his descent, he fires off one of his remaining shells as he won't be needing both. He repeats this a second time, and if you listen closely, you can hear the blue shell he initially fired making its way around the spiral. This is because Weatherton wasn't in first when he was hit, so the shell didn't expire, which leaves just 2 mini turbos to complete the final lap. The reason the lap skip works is the same as a lot of the other tracks, so I'll put the words on screen and you can say it with me this time. When he leaves the track, his section is behind the finish line. As he goes by the goal, he's within 20 path markers, so the finish line is activated and the game thinks he's in front of it. When he's placed back on the track, he's in first place as the game thinks he's just progressed around the entire track, and when he crosses the line, he'll be credited for a lap.
I'm the best!
Throughout the video, you may have noticed this icon in the bottom that was having the item odds from each track fed into it. If you were wondering what the odds were of this run happening without manipulation, it's this. A number so large it's not named. Let me know what we should call it down below. And that's the Mario Kart 64 tool-assisted speedrun. But this was released in 2016. It's been 7 years since then, and if you follow my channel, you know there's been a lot of discoveries in the meantime. In fact, when Drew first made this task, he didn't know why a lot of this stuff worked, as the details wouldn't be filled in until recently, as more people took an interest in the game. When an updated task is released, I'll be sure to let you know, as multiple tracks will need to be overhauled, and some tracks that previously didn't have skips have been broken in fantastic ways. But that's a story for another time. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you in the next exciting episode of Abyssoft Z. Oh, And please support me on Patreon.